Missing Chaos Emeralds, entire powered-up forms wiped from existence, characters with two entire separate and conflicting origin stories. These are all things that we've just come to accept as truth in the Sonic series. Yes, I'm talking about Retcons. A retcon, short for retroactive continuity, is when something established in a story's past is rewritten, ignored, or blatantly contradicted by new material. Sometimes it's a clean rewrite in order to get rid of moments in the overarching plot that don't really make a lot of sense. But other times it can be a continuity error that gets brute forced into canon simply because nobody seemed to notice it. Retcons are bound to happen, especially with a series with lore spanning over 30 years. But that doesn't mean they haven't caused confusion, controversy, and a handful of fiery fan debates. From the good to the bad and everything in between, this is a look at how retcons have shaped Sonic lore over the decades. Welcome to chaomix, and this is every retcon in the Sonic series. Pinning down retcons can be a bit tricky, because especially in the genre of video games, it can get kind of subjective. Like, is it canon that Sonic takes hour-long breaks in between each moment in the story to do his job as a single father and raise his children in the Chao Garden? Because that's what happened in my playthrough. Probably not though, right? But who's really to say? Well, me. I'm about to say, because this is my video. So here's my personal definition of a retcon that'll serve as the basis for each entry in this video. First off, I want to avoid talking about things that feel inconsistent just because of gameplay or meta fourth wall breaking reasons. For example, I wouldn't count stuff like how Sonic's top speed or moveset seems to change per game. I'm mainly only going to be talking about narrative level changes. The kinds of things that rewrite the story, the world, or the characters in a way that's meant to be taken as canon truth. So in short, these are mostly objective in-universe contradictions that reshape how we're supposed to understand Sonic's lore. Oh, and also we'll mainly only be talking about the games. So without further ado, let's begin with the first ever retcon to occur in the series, the Chaos Emeralds. It's a well-known fact that there are 7 Chaos Emeralds. But actually, it didn't always used to be this way. In the first Sonic the Hedgehog game, there were only 6. It wasn't until Sonic 2 where we had 7. Yeah, it only took a single game to change the entire lore as we once knew it. And if that isn't foreshadowing of the chaotic continuity changes to come, then I don't know what is. But the 6 Chaos Emeralds wasn't only a one-off thing. There were quite a few other early games that also had only 6 Chaos Emeralds, like Sonic 1 8-bit, Sonic 2 8-bit, Sonic Chaos, and Sonic Triple Trouble. Speaking of Chaos Emeralds, another retcon that's a bit more subjective because I don't think it's ever been confirmed verbatim, is that it's strongly implied that each island from the different Sonic games had their own set of emeralds. It explains a lot if you think about it. That's why they seem to vary so much in number. Sonic 1's South Island has 6, Sonic CD has the Time Stones, Sonic 2's West Side Island has 7, Sonic the Fighters has 8, and Sonic 3 has 7 Super Emeralds, which in and of themselves seem to not exist anymore, at least according to series director Takashi Iizuka, which seems to also mean that Sonic's Hyperform no longer exists. Yeah, that one's probably one of the more painful retcons on this list. But the inconsistent Chaos Emerald situation was all addressed and clarified from Sonic Adventure and on. From that game forward, there would be a strict 7 Chaos Emeralds across the entire world that the Sonic universe takes place in. So all those times that there were anything other than 7, yeah, just pretend that didn't happen. Anyway, another weird retcon is how they referred to Amy from her debut appearance in Sonic CD as Princess Sally, at least in the US instruction manual. As we all know, these are 2 completely separate characters. So what's up with that? A mistranslation? A huge oversight? Well, I think it's simply a result of a weird localization decision. It seems to me that Sega of America wanted to tie in the US cartoons into the games, since at that time, the US was kind of doing its own thing with Sonic's lore. And they did so by trying to retcon Amy as Princess Sally. Now that's some cultural appropriation if I've ever seen it. It's such a weird decision too, because any kid would easily be able to tell you that these are just 2 completely separate characters. Sonic CD and Sonic Sat AM, the US cartoon featuring Princess Sally, did release in the US around the same time. So I suppose it makes sense that they wanted to try and market what was going on here by injecting these characters into the games. We can see even more evidence of this in another game that was released around the same time, the US-developed Sonic game, Sonic Spinball. Here, we can find quite a few US Sonic cartoon and comic exclusive characters like Princess Sally, Bunny Rabbit, and Rotor. But this was all obviously a one and done thing, because after this, the US cartoon and comic cast never appeared again in the games. I think Sega of Japan didn't like Sega of America putting in their little American comic OCs into the games. Like I said, the US was doing its own thing with the lore, and a lot of the characters from the comics and TV shows straight up just didn't exist in the games. Yeah, that's a whole can of worms right there. Actually, yeah, let's get a bit deeper on this while we're on the topic. This is a huge rabbit hole of retcons. The US and Japanese lore of Sonic the Hedgehog varied greatly. Look no further than the Sonic Bible versus the Sonic the Hedgehog technical files. These were two different documents that laid out the ground rules of Sonic's world and characters. The Sonic Bible was a document created by Sega of America to help define Sonic's backstory for Western audiences. It paints Sonic as a rebellious punk rock teen who befriends a human scientist named Dr. Ovi Kintober, who later gets corrupted and transformed into Dr. Robotnik in a tragic lab accident. Meanwhile, in Japan, Sega developed a different set of internal documents known as the Sonic the Hedgehog technical files, which outlined the official Japanese lore of Sonic's universe. These describe Sonic as a mysterious lone hero from a fantastical world, like a fairy tale character whose legend spans generations. The lore unfolds across 3 episodes. A mother named Mary Granite writes Sonic stories to comfort her daughter, inspired by her pilot husband. A test pilot tragically dies while attempting to break the sound barrier, leaving behind a jacket with a Sonic emblem. And years later, a woman named Meg finds that jacket and has a near-death experience where Sonic seemingly saves her. Yeah, very different approaches to Sonic's lore. But in the end, we really don't see any elements of either of these origin stories nowadays. I mean, I guess it could be implied that each Sonic game is its own fairy tale, and who knows, maybe there is some kind of grand meta lore that these games are all just stories of Mary Granite. But there really isn't any evidence out there to concretely support this. In the end, it seems that both of these origin concepts were mostly retconned out of existence. But that doesn't mean that these documents didn't leave a lasting impact, especially in the early days. Yes, some of the lore from the Sonic Bible ended up sticking around for quite a while. For example, Sonic's world being called Mobius and its animal inhabitants being called Mobians. This was used in some of the US instruction manuals, and it was everywhere in the US TV shows and comics. It got repeated so often that fans kinda just accepted it as fact, even for the games, and even after it was quietly phased out of existence. But honestly, it still lingers to this day. You'll still hear people call Sonic's world Mobius and refer to its characters as Mobians, even though none of that was ever really the case in the official Japanese lore and has been retconned out of the US lore long ago. It's technically a huge misconception, but it doesn't help that stuff like the Sonic movies brought the name back again. Sure, the movies are their own separate continuity, but it just goes to show that once an idea catches on with an audience, it's really hard to shake, no matter how many retcons try to overwrite it. There's another thing I think should catch on, and it's brought to you by today's sponsor, Cove Pure, the 4-stage water purification system that removes up to 99.9% of harmful contaminants. Since I started using Cove Pure, there's just no going back to the nasty sink water lifestyle, and it's a lot less trips to the grocery store to refill on bottled water. All in all, it's just more convenient. It's ready at whatever desired temperature I need instantly, whenever I need some nice ice-cold water on a hot summer day, or some hot water for tea. And above all else, I genuinely notice the difference in taste and clarity. Listen, tap water isn't just gross, it can be dangerous. There's a handful of health impacts from drinking tap water, like links to cancer, obesity, and even brain development issues in kids. And forget bottled water. The average family spends over $1,300 a year on it. Not to mention the 240,000 nano and microplastic particles per liter. Cove Pure makes more sense than ever. With real-time water quality monitoring, no installation, and instant hot or cold water, it's a plug and purify upgrade your health will thank you for. It's cleaner, it's smarter, and it pays for itself. Go to covepure.com/chaomix today or use the link in my description to get $200 off. Huge thank you to Cove Pure for sponsoring today's video, and with all that being said, let's continue with today's episode. And with that, we're finally in the modern era. And we briefly touched on it, but Sonic Adventure did a lot to set the lore straight. Specifically, bridge the disconnect between the US and Japanese lore. And they mostly did this by erasing the US lore. Yeah. But there were more changes that would happen here besides just the narrative. Pretty much all of the main cast of characters got total overhauls. For example, the way they all look. Most characters got colored eyes, lankier limbs, and the art direction of the series was stylized in a completely different way. But yeah, of course you can argue that this all simply chalks up to the art style of the games, not necessarily a retcon. What doesn't chalk up to art style though are some of the characters' ages. The funny thing is, classic Sonic was often described as being 16 years old, but from Adventure and on, Sonic would be 15. Yeah, they really took my man and aged him down. But that's okay, it happens, especially when doing these sorts of soft reboots to franchises. Gotta break a few eggs to make an omelet, as they say. At the very least, it's evident that Sonic Adventure, although it had to change a few things, did so in order to keep the rest of the timeline from that point on a bit more consistent. And yeah, I'd say the series does a pretty good job at mostly keeping things straight from this point on. Mostly. Because as you can probably tell by looking at how much of this video is left, there's still a lot to talk about. For example, the moon. In Sonic Adventure 2, Eggman obliterates an entire portion of the moon with his Eclipse cannon. But then we see the moon in future games quite frequently, and it's completely intact. So, like, what the hell? Did it regrow? Well, not quite. There was an explanation given eventually by series director Takashi Iizuka on why the moon always appears whole, despite it being exploded by Eggman. According to him, the moon is just rotated to a side where we can't see the exploded section. I'm sorry. What? Well, that's certainly a way to fix the problem. But to be honest, I'm not buying it. I think this is the laziest possible way to cover up a simple oversight. And the chances of the moon always coincidentally being turned around is... I'm sorry, man, you're not fooling me. I personally still consider this a retcon until they give a better, more feasible reason. There are a few other things from Sonic Adventure 2 that can be argued to have been retconned, like how Shadow the Hedgehog was originally said to have been created by Gerald Robotnik, and how the Eclipse Cannon was built with nefarious purposes to destroy the Earth. But we find out in later games that it was actually Black Doom that helped create Shadow the Hedgehog, and the Eclipse Cannon was actually built to protect the Earth from the Black Comet. These are some examples where, sure, they never said in Sonic Adventure 2 that Black Doom didn't help make Shadow, but it definitely feels like one of those retroactive story additions that gets conveniently dropped into the lore to make the new plot work. Not quite a full-on retcon, but it sure walks and talks like one. But you want to know what was a full-on retcon? The Chaotix Crew, at least by the time they transition into the modern era. In Knuckles Chaotix, you had Knuckles, Mighty, Espio, Vector, and Charmy. But when the Chaotix Crew debuts for the first time in the modern era in Sonic Heroes, well, we're definitely down a person. Besides Knuckles obviously being in Team Sonic, Mighty is nowhere to be seen. In fact, he hasn't ever really had a modern era depiction. This dude is totally MIA in the modern timeline. And on top of that, Knuckles acts as if he's never met the other three in his life when he sees them again in Sonic Heroes. It's just weird considering what happens in Knuckles Chaotix. It's almost like the modern Chaotix Crew trio never existed until this game. Actually, I think that's exactly what they're trying to do here, and I can prove this. When going up against the first boss of the game, Charmy straight up implies that he's never met Eggman, which is clearly not the case if you've played Knuckles Chaotix. Eggman is totally there. He's literally the main bad guy of the game. So either their debut in Knuckles Chaotix got retconned and completely erased from existence in the timeline, or they forgot everything in the lobotomy. That was a difficult time for them. Man, I just love me some good old-fashioned narrative contradictions. But you want to know what was probably the worst of all of them in the entire series? In 2005, Sonic Rush released for the Nintendo DS. This game debuted Blaze the Cat, a princess from the Soul Dimension who crosses over into Sonic's world and eventually helps him put a stop to Dr. Eggman. It's a cute little backstory. But then comes Sonic 06, which also apparently debuts Blaze the Cat, a survivor of an apocalyptic timeline who goes back with her friend Silver the Hedgehog into the past to put a stop to a world-ending calamity. So, which is canon? Well, it can only be one of them, and I'm pretty sure it is in Sonic 06. The Sonic Rush backstory seems more feasible. That's what the IDW comics go with at least, and apparently these are canon, so... And besides, the end of Sonic 06 has Blaze sacrificing herself. And then, once the big bad of the game, Solaris, is defeated, it gets erased from all timelines. That means that, basically, all of the events of the game kind of never actually take place. And the game also implies that only Sonic remembers what happened. You'd assume that erasing Solaris from all timelines would also fix Blaze and Silver's timeline, so they'd have no reason or ability to even go back to the past and meet Sonic. This is where everything gets a bit messy, because how do you even explain Silver? He certainly continues to show up, like in Sonic Rivals and Sonic Forces, but how and why? He's from a totally different timeline that was fundamentally changed after the events of 06. And wouldn't nobody from Sonic's timeline remember who he is, since the end of the game shows the timeline reset along with everyone's memories? It just doesn't make any logical sense, unfortunately. Another thing that makes zero sense is how Sonic 4 episode Metal shows Metal Sonic totally Rob-maxing on Little Planet since his defeat by Sonic during the events of Sonic CD. But don't we totally see Metal Sonic make a ton of appearances in between these two games? Like, if Sonic CD takes place before Sonic 2 and Sonic 4 takes place after Sonic Mania and Superstars, we still have Metal Sonic appearances in Sonic the Fighters, Sonic Drift 2, Sonic R, Sonic Mania, and Sonic Superstars. There's probably even more appearances in there somewhere that I'm forgetting about. But the point is, this dude is all over the place but acts like he's been collecting dust since Sonic CD. So what, did he just put himself back where he belonged just for the cutscene in Sonic 4 episode Metal? It seems unlikely. It's certainly a bit frustrating, but not as frustrating as that time when Sonic Team tried to convince us that apparently, this entire time, all of these Sonic games and their stories that we had played through took place between two separate worlds, like two separate physical planets. And no, I am not making this up. Basically, any of the times that humans were heavily involved, like the NPCs of Station Square in Sonic Adventure, or the ones found throughout the world in Sonic Unleashed, well, those games took place on Earth. But games that took place in more whimsical environments like Green Hill or settings with a noticeable lack of humans, well, that was the entirely different world, the alleged second world. The planet where Sonic and his friends come from. This sudden retcon was heavily pushed during the Sonic Forces era. Maybe Sonic Team needed to bring it up to explain why the globe looked different than the one in Sonic Unleashed? But it was their way to explain why sometimes Sonic and friends inhabit worlds with humans and sometimes they didn't. Classic Sonic Team, unnecessarily answering questions nobody asked about. Luckily, this retcon was retconned by the time Sonic Frontiers came out. It's since been clarified that everything simply takes place on Earth. Thank the Lord. Because this narrative change came with so many questions. How did Sonic and friends travel between the two? Why do they travel between the two? What was Sonic's planet called? All questions we thankfully never have to ask again. Crisis avoided. But speaking of Sonic and friends and where they all live, even with the whole two worlds thing being retconned, recently there's been a bit of a push to claim that Sonic and friends reside in Green Hill, which is strange because this used to not be the case. Sonic's birthplace has been stated to be a location called Christmas Island, and besides that, Sonic is pretty much a nomad. He travels where the wind takes him and he takes little naps wherever his heart desires, and afterwards he's soon on the run again. For the rest of his friends, it was made very clear that some of these guys have actual homes. For example, we can see Tails' house in Emerald Town and Amy's room in Central City, both appearing in Sonic Battle. Green Hill, where Sonic and friends live, is kind of a new thing according to Sonic Prime, which in and of itself is allegedly canon, but I really doubt it, even though the creator claims it is. Side note, I do gotta say though, I love Amy's room in Sonic Battle. It just screams Amy Rose. You know, back when that used to mean something. Yeah, what I'm getting at is, Amy's personality seems to have done a complete 180 recently. Instead of the bubbly, cheerful girl that always chased Sonic around, never giving up hope that one day their love would blossom, has since been depicted as a more mature, melancholic girl who doesn't need any man. I get that adoring Sonic isn't Amy's entire personality, and I'm not saying it should be. But man, I'd be lying if I said Amy hasn't felt the same since. The thing is, this in of itself isn't a retcon, but this isn't just a sudden change to her personality going forward. They're going as far as to go back in time and rewrite history. We can see evidence of this in Sonic X Shadow Generations. In the Sonic Generations portion of the game, they actually went as far as to retcon certain dialogue to better fit the character's current day depictions. Look at Amy's description, for example. The original version described her as a Sonic-obsessed go-getter, but now she's a girl who has a hammer and likes tarot cards. The erasure of Amy's passion goes crazy. It goes deeper than this though, because it isn't just Amy. They seem to keep making Rouge a lot more modest, covering up her chest and even her back. What's wrong, Sega? Afraid of a little skin? They even changed a few cutscenes, altering scenes that I guess they deemed too mean-spirited, like Sonic pushing Amy away in this scene, or Amy shoving Knuckles into a tree in this scene. These were really funny gags in the original that really emphasized how comfortable and almost sibling-like all these characters were towards each other. But they totally diluted these interactions into stale, lifeless husks of their former selves. But enough about Sonic Generations. Its other half, Shadow Generations, has a few things that some might consider retcons. For example, even before the game came out, in the prologue animation, The Dark Beginnings, it's revealed that when Emerald went berserk on the Space Colony Ark, it was actually Shadow who stopped him. Before this animation dropped, it was stated that it was a handful of scientists who managed to subdue him. We also learn more about the Robotnik family here, like how Gerald had 2 sons and Maria actually had a younger sister. Not necessarily retcons, but definitely some interesting retroactive additions to the story. I really think everything here actually acts to enhance the pre-existing plot. Those are the best kind of retcons. 2 big thumbs up from me. But do you want to know one of my least favorite retcons? In Sonic Adventure, Chaos is worshipped as a deity of sorts by the ancient Echidna tribe. They had murals and everything. And it was the wrath of this god that ended the clan's lineage when they went power-hungry from the Chaos Emeralds. The plot of Sonic Adventure and its themes of hubris and consequence makes for one of the best narratives in the series in my opinion. But there's a retcon that happens in a game much later on that, to be honest, kind of ruins a lot of the impact of this moment. In Sonic Frontiers, we get introduced to the Ancients, a long-lost alien civilization who originally brought the Chaos Emeralds to Earth. They, sure look a lot like Chaos, don't they? Well, it's revealed that their entire race put their souls into these masks called Coco, and it's implied that the Coco would eventually evolve over time into the Chao. And we know that Chaos is a mutated Chao. So what this all means is that Chaos's origins are not that of a god, he's just another one of the Ancients. In the end, it turns out Chaos really isn't all that special, huh? At least not to the level of a god. I mean, maybe the fact that he was able to mutate back into the Ancient's original form does kind of make him special, but he's nowhere near the level of a deity like he's depicted to be in Sonic Adventure. It's definitely not as cool. Retcons can suck, but they aren't inherently bad. While yeah, there are some that totally blow and feel kind of unnecessarily and poorly written, there are totally retcons that enhance the story. Alright, I gotta go now before Sega decides to retcon me.